the agenda is VMware, what you need to know about vSphere 7. So we've got Ken Willard. He'll be presenting. He's an instructor. He's been teaching for, best I can tell, the past 15 plus years. I'm sure he can give more on that. One of the best, if not the best, VMware instructor that I know of. So full of information, wants to be help to you. And you'll see here on the screen, if you have questions, if you want to get pricing, if you want to enroll, if you want to have a conversation, whatever you take from this from an action perspective, make sure you reach out to WebAge, let them know what questions you have. And if needed, we can always schedule a call, even get Ken on the call, dive through some of this, and ultimately figure out what you need, what your team may need, what your organization may need from a VMware education perspective. So with that being said, I'm gonna turn over to Ken.
At this point, we are up to vSphere 7. So we've been through quite a few evolutions. And so we're going to talk about, frankly, a little bit around some of the original announcements, right, back in the April-May timeframe, and then what we've seen. If any of you are regular VMware customers and you pay attention to the VMware Twitter feeds or the VMware news postings, those types of things, we got some interesting announcements this week as well. Right, so when we first saw the initial announcement, right, you think about vSphere, for a lot of us, it's really just the core virtualization that, at least what we think about on sort of a day-to-day basis. They really came out with this idea of other components in the platform that were really relevant. So things like the unified platform services, what they very kind of loosely referred to as developer services on this slide. The folks, that translates right into Tanzu and container-based services, right? We've got some new solutions. The other big one that I think may interest a lot of folks is what's listed as intrinsic security in the graph so far. And that's a lot to do with being able to establish hardened, secure management infrastructure, including a key management infrastructure. And then from there, when you boot your ESX hosts in what would be considered your workload or production environments, we actually have the ability to verify the host, verify the code levels, and ensure that that is a trusted platform. And so for those of you that have very high security operating requirements, the intrinsic security behaviors go a long way in what we're seeing in version 7. Then we got some really great new stuff around lifecycle of your vSphere environment. The big thing is, for those of us today who've been with the product for years, you're running 6.0, 6.5, 6.7, you're used to probably doing your patch management through Update Manager. We replace that in this version with Lifecycle Manager. And folks, this is not just a rebranding effort. They have substantially changed the underpinnings of how we can do updates if it fits with your operational practices. And so I'm going to show you a little bit of that. We don't have actually time to go through a full lifecycle demo, but I am certainly going to point that out and let you see that in the user interface. And then a couple of things that sort of help with future processes. One is the update planner. And what that does is it goes through and it looks at where things are from a code level, right? Which update are you running? What virtual machine hardware do you have deployed across your infrastructure? And making sure that upgrades are going to go successfully. Here's the one catch. For those of you that are seeing that on the slide deck and you're kind of getting excited about this is going to help you get onto version 7, it's not. Right? This is a tool that comes with version 7 and is forward-looking from here on in. So there's some programmatic hooks and some things that we need to get those tasks done of being able to evaluate future updates. So those are built into the 7.0 platform, but that update planner does not help you get to 7.0, so just be aware. And the other interesting one, I don't know how many of you have very large, sort of broad-ranging environments with lots of vCenters. Right? If you're running maybe, say, around the globe, follow the sun data center operations, and you've got multiple data centers. Right? 6, 8, 10 is not uncommon to have lots of vCenters deployed into those data centers. It can become really challenging to do policy management and configuration consistency and enforce that across multiple physical data centers running multiple vCenter instances. And we now have vCenter profiles where there are aspects of your policies and your configurations of vCenter that you can make in a master vCenter node, and those then trickle down into the rest of your vCenter deployments in your environment. And so kind of a powerful tool if you run sort of big, geographically dispersed or just multi vCenter deployments. We got a lot from also kind of around a security standpoint, right? You see this is the branch off of that intrinsic security. We've got some changes in certificate management. We've got some changes in trust authority. I talked about that. That's the ability to be able to verify the servers that are running ESXi, their software load, those kinds of things. But honestly, folks, I think the biggest one from a day-to-day production is the idea of identity federation. And with identity federation, we start to leverage some connectivity into Windows, and that gives us really nice, clean two-factor authentication into your vCenter environment. And so I personally think identity federation is going to be a big one that we see a lot of early adoption on, because it gives you that two-factor and a nice way, a clean way to do two-factor authentication into your vCenter environment. All right, so swinging around to the other half of this illustration, we start looking at things that are happening in core virtualization, as well as some of the things that are supporting artificial intelligence, operations, those types of things. We've got some new behaviors with core resource management, core capabilities, right? Core storage, you see those outlined, particularly around resource management. I'm going to break down later in the slides some of the specifics around the changes in DRS and vMotion. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on those here because we're going to give those some highlight a little later in the discussion. But what we don't spend a whole lot of time on, because it's a little bit of speeds and feeds, is the idea of support for new virtual CPUs. Obviously, as Intel and AMD continue to expand their offerings, we continue to see VMware increase the support or certify the support around those new products. We also got virtual hardware version 7. We're going to talk about some things around the scalability of virtual hardware. I said 17, apologies. But the functional things that we've got, the two that I think, again, are probably the most readily adopted or going to be the most readily adopted is the vWatchdog services. This is sort of the next evolution. Many of you may be familiar. In HA, we have the ability to monitor a heartbeat that comes out of VMware tools and gives us some sense of, is the virtual machine healthy or not? Right? If the guest OS crashes, it's going to take VMware tools down with it. We'll lose that heartbeat, obviously. vWatchdog extends that behavior, that monitoring a little further, and we can start to look at CPU usage and some other metrics to determine if maybe an OS has hung processes but hasn't actually crashed. So giving us some better insight into the health of our VMs. And the other one there around virtual hardware 17, I think, is the precision clock. A lot of times we know that when we think about virtualization, right, with the scheduling events that are happening, we can have time drift in our VMs, right? And from most perspectives, that's okay. Right? In general purpose applications, we aren't so concerned about precision clocks. But if you get into high transaction rate say, sales websites or financial transaction sites, we care about the precision clock behavior, right? So we've got that supported feature now as well. So a couple of things off of the elastic artificial intelligence, machine learning capabilities. Bitfusion, we're seeing a little bit of that product get folded in from a tech preview perspective, but the big one I think there is the assignable hardware. We know that when we're thinking about artificial intelligence or machine learning engines, a lot of times those applications leverage GPUs because of the faster throughput of the processing, right, as opposed to a conventional CPU process. But that used to give us a problem because once we associated a virtual machine with a GPU to leverage that processing capability, we could no longer vMotion that VM. So with some of the new assignable hardware support, we now have the ability to actually be able to vMotion a virtual machine and still continue to deliver GPU support to the processes running inside of it. So that's kind of a big improvement there. So then we think about developer services, a lot of things here, but I think, frankly, the biggest ones, and we're going to talk about that, is the integration of Tanzu services. Folks, if you've got developers, if your teams are starting to move from what we would consider conventional, sort of monolithic applications with a waterfall development style, and you're moving to a microservices application architecture and container-based delivery of that, we now have the ability for those developers to be able to communicate with vSphere and deploy container-based implementations using Kuba control right out of their Kubernetes environment that they're already used to using. So that was a big part. And then at last, the big thing up here is actually calling out specifically vSphere with Kubernetes. And again, that goes right back to this idea of we are seeing application development change. Organizations are starting to move away from these big single entity applications that do everything into microservices architecture. And we want to be able to support that on vSphere without causing the hypervisor to be a bottleneck or without causing it to be an administrative burden. Right, so we think about that with the whole vSphere with Kubernetes and what VMware is calling their Tanzu runtime environment. And that's really your Kubernetes support right there. We get that integrated right into vSphere. So suspect most of you are running, I sort of rattled them off earlier, right? 6.0, 6.5, 6.7, we're still seeing a lot of all of those versions out in production deployments today. Folks, be very careful. I'm sure if you're in this situation, you already know, but your 6.0 code, right, those are all end of life, end of support. So if you're running those, you're in a scenario where you're either running an unsupported environment or somebody in your organization has approved a special support contract, right? And those things are kind of painfully expensive. The other thing to be aware of is if you are at 6.5 base code or earlier, you cannot do a direct upgrade to 6.7 or to 7.0 rather, right? So you'll have to do that intermediate upgrade, typically to 6.7. And so now you're stretching out your update cycles. So just kind of be aware of that, right? If you are still on 6.5 GA release or older, you got to at least be thinking about getting to 6.5, update 1, update 2, and be able to support then the transition. A lot of the news around vSphere 7 when it came out was all about containers, right? There was a ton of promotion. I've already been talking about Kubernetes and container-based deployments in the short few minutes we've been talking here. Why? Because we're seeing major adoption in the enterprise space. And we all know, right? You may not be in the enterprise space today, but we know that things that happen with the enterprise today trickle down into the commercial business space and ultimately land in the SMB business space. So today we're seeing a ton of Kubernetes deployment. Right, it's growing explosively year over year. And by 2 years from now, we're expecting that 77% of businesses worldwide will deploy containers primarily in the data center, not in some cloud-based approach. Right? Containers really got their start in the cloud. Frankly, a lot of that came out of Google and Facebook with their web scale architectures. But organizations are still running hybrid deployments. Data processing is happening on premises as well in the cloud, and we're seeing a lot of deployment of containers. It's going to be happening on premises. And so right now, that's a bit of a painful process. When you think about where we are today and where we're expected to be next year, we're going to have to find a way to manage a 50% growth. And this may not be true in your organization, but across IT worldwide, we're going to see a 50% growth of 500 million containers. Folks, if we thought virtual machine sprawl was a problem and something that we were trying to figure out how to manage, containers and microservices from an operational perspective make that 1,000 times worse. Right? They are great for development. They are great for continuous application improvement and continuous application development models. But from an infrastructure management perspective, they are a heartache and a nightmare. And so being able to have a clean way to handle this explosive growth is one of the biggest things about vSphere 7. Right? Again, a lot of us who have been in the IT industry for a while, we think about an application as this one thing, an executable that gets installed, right? And it runs and does everything that we need to do. It's got the shopping cart. It's got the address management piece, right? It is what they call a monolithic application. And that's not where code development is headed in the future. When we look at what's happening with current development, we're seeing this microservices architecture where each piece of code is responsible for its own individual function. And some of that may run on premises in our data centers. We may be leveraging all of you see listed up here, the 3 sort of big US cloud providers. Those of you that are doing global operations, you may be leveraging operations in the Alibaba cloud in the Asia Pacific region. And so how do we start to coordinate and manage this from an infrastructure perspective when these applications are being carved into these little pieces and distributed across the architecture, and some of it's not on premises for us anymore? Right, the definition, and this is kind of what we're talking about. We used to think about these monolithic applications that talked to a database and they drove the entire workflow, whatever that application was supposed to do. Today, that's all carved up, right? Some of it might be running in VMs. Some of it might very well be running in virtual machines that are GPU dependent. We think about that extremely fast processing that we get from GPUs versus conventional CPUs. But a lot of it's happening with Kubernetes, and we see a lot of it happening with what we call serverless architecture. Right? That's an interesting model wherein, and we're seeing this in the cloud generally, but instead of deploying either a virtual machine or a container, we've just got a piece of code that sits out in the cloud provider's environment. And when we need to run it, the cloud provider is responsible for spinning up what's required to run it. Usually they're doing that with some kind of a container. They run that little tiny snippet of code for us, and they bill us for the 2 seconds that it ran. And so now, instead of having a whole virtual machine or even a whole container up and running, we've now only paid for the exact number of seconds of compute that the serverless function used. Right, so more distributed systems, harder to get our hands around. And the other problem with this is, of course, is developers want to go to this. This is fantastic for them, gives them more flexibility in coding. But as I was just saying, this is a nightmare for those of us on the systems team and the operations team that have to manage and secure and make sure that these new models are compliant with our security and audit policies. If this becomes, we've always sort of had a disconnect or maybe a difference in priorities between the ops team and the development team and the ops team and the line of business team. But folks, container-based and microservices architectures are going to make that disconnect far worse. So what we got back in, right, the March, April timeframe was the new release of vSphere. And when that announcement was made, we had what they were calling vSphere 7 with Kubernetes. And that was available only if you were buying the Cloud Foundation architecture. If you're familiar with Cloud Foundation, it is their turnkey solution to buy core vSphere, vSAN for your storage virtualization, and NSX for your network virtualization. Well, that's great, and it actually is a fantastic way to do the deployment. But it sort of left us with a little bit of a gap, in my opinion, because if you were still running conventional vSphere, that's what you got. You still got conventional virtual machine-based architectures. So let's talk through the two versions, the two approaches that we got back in March, April. Right, so vSphere with Kubernetes, the idea here was with that full software virtualized stack for both or for all three, compute, networking, and storage, it gave us that ability to let developers manage infrastructure, deploy new containers, leverage virtual networks, all through the Kubernetes APIs, which meant that Kuba control system that they were already accustomed to, let them do everything they need. Right? It was compliant with the Kubernetes standards, and it was extremely fast in its performance. And so now when we look at that sort of bumping of heads that had previously been an issue, that starts to ease the pressure on that. We've now got a scenario where developers can talk to their resource deployment engine, which in this case becomes vSphere. They can do that through the command controls that they are accustomed to. Us that are on the systems and operations team, we continue to look at our world through vCenter, but now we get to see those Kubernetes objects as native objects in vCenter. And that's extremely powerful to us because then we can do things like apply storage policies and apply management permissions and all of those things that we think about doing with our virtual machine infrastructure. We can now apply that to a container-based infrastructure. And we're getting the best of both worlds. So when we think about this, right, we've got the Kubernetes cluster deployed, and they have the ability to deploy the management infrastructure. And then on vSphere, we get native container-based pods. Very efficient, running right on top of the ESXi hypervisor, and those can now sit side by side with the native virtual machine approach that we've been running for the last 20 years. Right, the Kubernetes team has complete management capability. If you don't do a lot with Kubernetes, don't get particularly hung up on this slide. Just be aware that this is the syntax for that Kuba control management plane that they have access to. And what they are able to do is define exactly what they need for the various resources. So developers get to do their deployment management, and then we as vCenter admins get to see those as native objects in our inventory. And so all those, like I said, all those things we're accustomed to: security policies, storage performance policies, the ability to leverage HA and DRS services at the cluster level. All of those container-driven entities now get the advantage of those core vSphere services. All right, so that was the model back in March, April timeframe. And so if you were ready to step up to that vSphere Cloud Foundation model and run all three products, you were good to go. The other alternative was, if you weren't quite to that point, right, we could stay with conventional vSphere and run vSphere 7. And it came with its own collection of benefits, right? Big time. We got much better lifecycle management. We kind of talked about that in the opening slide. We got better security architecture, and we got a lot of changes in application performance. The way we treat our VMs, both for DRS and for vMotion events, has drastically changed, and changed for the better, frankly. So let's walk through these a little bit. All right, improve lifecycle management. And I touched on some of these again in that early stage. So just very similar to what we had with Update Manager, right? We've got that desired end state, that picture that we're trying to get to, and we can look at our inventory and figure out those systems where there are discrepancies or where we need to do patching and remediation. I talked about the update planner, right? That again helps us once we get on to 7, looking at go forward updates from there. We've had this kind of support for a while, the ability to do, right, particularly REST-based automation. So I don't see that as anything particularly new. But the other one that is new is the addition of, when we go from Update Manager, which we're accustomed to in the 6.x family, to Lifecycle Manager, we also add the ability to start to look at the hardware and manage firmware updates at the hardware level. So much nicer consolidated management there. The idea of identity federation. And this starts, right, initially we're just tying into the native Active Directory Federation services. So that is the first solution that VMware came to market with. And that's what lets us then leverage two-factor authentication with whatever service we have set up for two-factor in our Active Directory environment. And what they've said is the Active Directory Federation services are just the first one, right? They will continue to work with the channel partner environment and integrate other identity federation options into vSphere over its lifecycle. But this means that we don't have any credentialing stored in vSphere. It's all stored in your existing directory service that you're already using. And we now get to leverage really clean two-factor authentication for your vSphere environment. So let's talk what changed in DRS. And I'm going to show you some of this in the upcoming demo. But you all are probably familiar with this view, right? This is what they call the DRS widget in your cluster summary tab. Historically, DRS has been through actually one evolution before. The version that we're accustomed to in the 6.x family really looks to level the utilization across your ESX hosts. That's where this idea of having a balanced cluster comes from, is that we have consistent utilization across the hosts. And the thinking there, the reason it was architected that way was that then if we had a high availability event, if we had a host that failed and we needed to do failover activities, that meant then that the loads were already fairly uniformly distributed, and we could then very quickly bring the failed VMs back up across the capacity in the remaining hosts, and we wouldn't likely get into a lot of resource contention when that happened. And that was great, served us well, obviously, for years. But when you think about this idea of a couple of things that are really happening today, one, we're seeing larger and larger virtual machines deployed. When you look at the virtualization requirements for large, high transaction rate databases, sometimes folks doing data lakes or Hadoop big data processing in virtual machines, big VMs over there. And now I want to also, in the same environment, potentially put containers, which are literally the other end of the spectrum, right? The idea behind a container, it is this little tiny thing that is very, very fast to run and execute. So now this idea of having a cluster level awareness or a cluster level perspective of how my resources are being consumed really doesn't make a whole lot of sense. So what the new version of DRS is workload centric. It is looking at the resources needed by virtual machines, or if you're starting to deploy containers on top of vSphere, the resources needed by those containers, and make sure that each workload you're deploying is getting the right resources. So we won't have this flat, uniform utilization across our hosts anymore. We're going to get maybe hosts that are very dissimilar in how much workload they're doing, but the VMs and containers running on those hosts are going to be running very efficiently. The other thing that started happening as we looked at these bigger and bigger VMs, again, to house massive databases and massive Hadoop big data processing, if those VMs ever had to be vMotioned, and if any of you have done this, you've seen this happen, we wind up in a scenario where the vMotion either takes a really long time and negatively impacts the performance of that VM, or in some cases, frankly, just fails and it isn't able to complete. So the vMotion architecture has been completely rewritten. And so now we can handle those extremely large virtual machines from a memory perspective and be able to fail them over, or not fail them over, but move them over very, very quickly with no disruption of these massive workloads that are running inside of them. Major improvement there. Right, so that's it. If you want integrated containers right from the start, you step up and you migrate your entire environment to vCloud Foundation. If you're still really VM focused, you can hang out and run with just vSphere 7, right? Well, maybe not exactly. If any of you caught the announcements back on Tuesday of this week, I think VMware made a pretty substantial play on Tuesday. They released vSphere 7 Update 1, and effective Tuesday, if you go to that update, and I know we all maybe have thoughts about running first releases of something, but all they've really done is those Tanzu services, the native container services with ESX, they've brought those down from being available only in the vCloud Foundation license bundle to now, if you are running what had been conventional virtual machine-based vSphere 7, you now have the ability to run native containers. So Tuesday, I think, frankly, I think the announcement back in March, April was big and important. For me, what happened Tuesday of this week, I think is even bigger, because it makes the native container behavior available to everybody running vSphere. whether you're ready to run vSAN and NSX or not, you can still get native container services now. So this is what this looked like originally, right? We had the idea of vCloud Foundation. And the big thing, of course, about vCloud Foundation was it was that turnkey bundle. vSphere for compute, NSX for virtual networking, vSAN for virtual storage, and you also happen to get vRealize in that package. So it was a lot of resource, but it was also a little on the pricey side. And the fact of the matter was, if you had already invested in, say, other storage architecture, and you're just starting maybe a 3-year lease around that storage, you don't want to replace that with vSAN. That's not an intelligent financial decision. So what we got on Tuesday of this week was vSphere 7 with Tanzu, not vCloud Foundation. And you'll notice you wouldn't have had vRealize with conventional vSphere already. So you don't have vRealize, right? That part's gone. And then for virtual networking and virtual storage, it's now a bring your own model. So the core vSphere services will support whatever virtualization engine you want to bring for your virtual network structure, and whatever storage architectures you already have, whatever you're already supporting with vSphere. So I think this is a fantastic opportunity, especially for, frankly, the commercial and SMB business sectors to start moving into some of those container-based deployments. Right? And folks, even if you don't write your own software and you're thinking, well, this doesn't apply to me because I don't write my own apps. We don't have a development team. This doesn't matter. I think in the next 2 to 3 years, we are going to see the off-the-shelf applications that we're accustomed to buying. Those are going to be moved to a container deployed architecture. And so when you buy your antivirus management suite or your data center backup management suite, whatever those are, I think you're probably going to see those start to very quickly change from a VM and application deployed model to a container and microservices deployed model from these off-the-shelf software vendors. And so the sort of big catch here is in the bring your own, we still have to have kind of a true software-defined networking architecture there. Core vSphere switch infrastructure is not going to do it. Right? So the big thing there is you've got to bring something else in, and right now VMware is recommending the Atreya product. Probably not something you've ever heard of. It is their open source virtual switch infrastructure. It is based on the Open vSwitch standard open virtual switch architecture. So you got a little bit of heavy lifting to do to integrate Atreya into your environment, but it would let you do it at no additional cost and start to work with containers. The other thing that we got on Tuesday of this week, for how many years has an ESX cluster been 64 hosts? As of Tuesday, that number is 96 hosts per cluster. So if you need to start scaling out your cluster count to have your workloads all supported, unless it now exceeds 96, you don't have to run a multi-cluster environment due to the cluster host count limit. The other thing that was kind of staggering, when we first got vSphere 7, our virtual machines moved up to the ability to support 256 virtual CPUs and 6 terabytes of RAM, which I thought was big at the time. As of Tuesday, if you are running vSphere 7 Update 1, you may now build a VM that supports 768 virtual CPUs and 24 terabytes of memory. Folks, let me be clear. This is not the supported spec for a host. That is the supported spec for a virtual machine. They're calling them monster VMs, which I think is probably a good reference. All right, so I probably squeezed myself. I'm probably down to about 5 to 7 minutes here, and I want to switch over and do a little bit of a live demo, walk you through some of the features and some of the things that we have in our version 7 virtual environment. So obviously I've got a setup here. We're pre-logged in. By the way, been talking an awful lot about what we do have in version 7. Just as important, and I certainly want to mention this at the top of the demo, is what don't we have in version 7? First of all, this version no longer supports a Windows-hosted vCenter. So if you are still running vCenter as an installed application running on top of some Windows Server class OS, folks, now is the time to start thinking about that migration path. There's some really clean migration tools available to you to migrate off of the Windows hosted vCenter model onto the vCenter Linux-based virtual appliance model. It runs for a while. I've done that exercise a couple of times with customers. It's potentially a lengthy, time-consuming operation, but it's a zero downtime from a management perspective, and it runs consistently. So that's the first thing, no Windows vCenter. The second thing is, and I frankly don't know of a single customer that deployed this, but if you did deploy a separate vCenter and platform services controller, right, we could separate those two things into two different VMs, and the thought was maybe some load balancing, some workload distribution, maybe it was a little more efficient. That goes away. No, frankly, nobody really needed to leverage that after they started seeing production deployments. And so today, there is no standalone platform services controller. You got to plan a migration path around that. And again, there's a tool to get you through it. The last thing, and I don't know how many of you have been sort of holding off, folks, there is no vSphere web client in version 7. The web client is the one that was written in Adobe Flex, required Adobe Flash to be installed. We all know the days of Flash are numbered, right? That's coming out of the data center. So with version 7, it is only HTML5 user interface administration. And so talking about the UI, right? One of the nice things here, if you're a fan of this, we've had this actually since the 6-7 days, but we now have a dark mode. Right? We were getting this in a lot of systems today. So if you prefer this look and feel, right, you can absolutely switch your vCenter view over to dark mode and have that flavor or feel. I'm going to go back to the standard for the rest of the demo because I think it probably broadcasts better. One of the other things that I love in the new architecture, you're probably all familiar. If you're building clusters, you go to the cluster, you right-click, you say add a host, and you have to do that on a one-at-a-time host basis in the 6.x family. Well, I'm going to do that a little differently. I'm going to go to my data center. So we were talking about the way that you add hosts to a cluster is much easier today, I think. So if I create a quick demo cluster, and I'll just turn on DRS services. That one's nice and easy. The other thing that you notice is down here, we start to have this option that we're showing says manage all hosts in the cluster with a single image. We're going to come back and talk about that when we get into the lifecycle manager part that I'm going to walk you through here in a minute. So we're not going to do that at the moment. And so now I have a new cluster with no hosts in it. And you'll notice when I do that, it immediately takes me to the clusters configuration tab. And I have over here in the details the ability to add hosts. Now, let me right-click pop up on the cluster and do add hosts. I now have the ability to do multiple hosts at a time. I think this is such a huge improvement in the workflow of building clusters. So if we start adding our ESX hosts, I want to copy that. We are going to use root as the password. And then I can go down and add a second host to my new cluster very quickly. And at that point, then I'm just going to come up here and say use the same credentials for all hosts because I know they were all pre-configured with the same set of credentials. So we've got one host that it doesn't recognize the certificate, so I have to accept that. And then once we go from there, it's ready to go. And you see the note, it will put the hosts into maintenance mode, move them into the cluster, and then bring them back online. So we'll expand out that. And so now we've got our clusters built. It's verified that we've got time synchronization. Folks, hopefully that's one of the things, if you've ever been to a VMware class, the instructor has talked about time synchronization, not only between your hosts, but the hosts and the vCenter and all of the infrastructure in your data center need to be getting their host from the same master timekeepers. All right, and then we have to go through, we can look, see what services are turned on. If we wanted to configure other services, we could do that. Or I can start bringing these hosts online by manually bringing them out of maintenance mode. So that was one of the things that I thought was a huge usability improvement. If you're in an environment where, say, you periodically do restructures for test dev operations, those kinds of things, and you are creating and destroying clusters as part of those test dev deployments, makes a huge improvement. The other thing is looking at our virtual machines today. When I click on a virtual machine and on its summary tab, you see we've now got an option to switch to a new view that was released in version 7. And I'm going to collapse my recent tasks so we can get a good sense of what's going on here. And then I'm going to switch to the new view. We just get a little bit of a different layout. I personally think it's cleaner. And the other really nice thing about this is these panels can now be restructured. So if I really want to make sure that I keep track of if a virtual machine has snapshots, I can grab that handle, maybe it'll cooperate, and move it up so that it's in the top view, right? So now I've got the sort of normal summary details and any snapshots. So that's the new view for your virtual machines that are available in the V7 interface. The other sort of new view that we started talking about, and I'll go to my compute cluster that we had prepped and ready because I've already got some VMs up and running. I'm going to go to its summary tab. Prepped this morning. DRS is already configured. I powered up some VMs, obviously. And so now we have the DRS widget, just like we've always had at the cluster level. But now I get a breakdown of the DRS score, where I would have previously had that bubble level graphic and been looking at, again, the utilization of the hosts and ensuring that the hosts were evenly unified. In this case, we're concerned about the individual workloads. And so we can see that in this case, those workloads are made up of 3 virtual machines, and they're all in the high performance settings. So they're calling this, if you read some of the documentations, they're also calling this the happiness score. And I mentioned this earlier, the idea behind that is the workloads have the resources that they are entitled to, right? So this is now being calculated on a per workload basis. The other thing that's happened in DRS, if you've been working with it for a while, you know that it used to do evaluations and calculate the performance behaviors at a 5-minute interval. With the new DRS in version 7, that interval is reduced to once a minute. So it's being much more granular about its monitoring and making sure that things are getting the resources they need. And it does that evaluation and builds those on what's called a goodness model. And so it's making sure that the throughput that the VM needs and the throughput that it's getting are the same. And it does that for CPU, memory, and network with the new DRS. So pretty substantial change there. And then the one last thing I want to show you is the new options around Lifecycle Manager. So I'm going to go all the way up to the vCenter object here. Actually, nope, I'm going to go to the data center object and then click on updates. And so I still have that very traditional baseline model. I can manage VMware tools. I can manage virtual machine hardware versions, just like I've always been able to do. But what I now have is this new images option. Right, so if I click on one of my clusters, not looking at this from the data center perspective, but looking at this from the cluster perspective and go to updates, my user interface is going to change a little bit. Right, I am now at a cluster management level. And when I get to that level, you'll notice when we built the cluster, it said, do you want to manage this cluster with a single image? I now in Update Manager have that same option. So you can go through here and say learn more, but the idea behind this is when you say manage with a single image, what's going to happen is it's going to build a full ESX image, including all of the ESX VIBs, the virtual installation bundles, or the vSphere installation bundles that it needs so far as drivers to talk to controller cards, plug-in modules that you've built or installed from certain vendors. All of those types of things are going to get built into that single image. And then when you update at the cluster level, it is going to push that exact identical image onto every ESX host. Folks, the idea behind this is we all know that consistency in versioning, patch levels, all of those types of things build both a more reliable and a more secure operating environment. And so with single image management, we can absolutely guarantee that every host is running the same code base, including security patches and any subcomponents that are sort of hardware or third-party vendor provided. The obvious downside to that is you've got to have either identical or very, very similar hardware, right? I cannot manage a cluster with a single image if that cluster is made up of very dissimilar hardware. It's not going to work. So if you do have the luxury of similar hardware, this gives you a way to ensure that consistency. So those are some of the things I wanted to call out sort of as it related to the user interface or operational changes. Again, apologies. Hopefully the team post wrapping this up, they'll be able to pull this together and distribute the two different recordings for everybody, and you'll be able to see the demo as well as sort of the conversational piece around what's new so far as version 7 and version 7 update 1 that came out this week.